Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to ADBI Distinguished Speakers Series. I'm Tetsushi Sonobe, the Dean of Asian Development Bank Institute. Today, we are pleased to welcome Professor Satish Uksuri of the Ryle School of Civil Engineering at Purdue University. He is the director of the Urban Mobility Networks and Intelligence Lab. About 1 month ago, he gave us very interesting, stimulating seminar introducing his research on the resilience of cities to disasters and the application of mobility data to a bunch of interesting research topics. Today, Professor Uksuri will discuss the benefits and costs of recently popular ride-sharing services, the use of big data to quantifying the inequalities and the externalities associated with these services, and the regulations to mitigate these problems, and finally, how to reopen modes of transportation, including ride-sharing services after COVID-19. Professor Uksuri, welcome back. And thank you very much for accepting our request to give a seminar at night from the United States. Now the screen and the microphone are yours. The audience and I will stay muted. Professor, please unmute your microphone and start.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dean Sonobe, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So it's again a great pleasure to be here. So today what I want to do is I want to share with you some of our thoughts on this mobility as a service, smart mobility, for-hire vehicles, any name that you can give to this type of technology that we are seeing in cities and transforming transportation, and the significant impact that they actually have on cities. So I want to kind of share with you both the positive as well as the negative. There have been a lot of media articles on the positive benefits of this. But my goal today is to kind of also share with you some of the costs of having these technologies in cities, particularly in terms of the economic costs and then the impacts that it has on people. Okay? This is a work which is one of the core interests of my lab, the Urban Mobility and Network Intelligence Lab, which I lead at Purdue University. I work with very motivated PhD students and postdocs. So this is a collaboration with mainly with my PhD students and various companies and agencies. You're going to see a list of those towards the end, okay? So I've been kind of in this transportation space for almost 20 years now. I had both my master's and PhD work in transportation systems. So I'm familiar with some of the core problems in transportation related to planning, operations, finance, and so on. So this is a bit about my experience in transportation. So my lab, we work on smart mobility using data from these taxis and cell phones and social media to understand the dynamics of these cities. We work on the intersection of electricity and mobility options, so e-mobility, and to see how electrification is going to help our cities be more green. We look at sustainability policies, like for example, the personal mobility carbon allowance schemes, where we kind of give incentives at the household level to reduce carbon consumption. And we try to see how that can be scalable across cities and what the impacts of that are. So we have looked at various sustainable transportation options in cities. One of my expertise is autonomous transportation. So we do both the modeling and testing of autonomous transportation systems. Then intermodal transportation, so where you're looking at the trade impacts and leveraging various forms of transportation between truck, rail, and sea routes. And we looked at logistics, both in terms of first and last mile delivery, and combining with this with autonomous systems like crowd shipping. How do you use the crowd to transport and make the last and first mile more efficient? So we kind of span the entire range of transportation cities, The scale at which we work is primarily at the city scale. So we also do some work at the more like intersection and corridor level, but our primary scale is city, state, or country level analysis. And I'm kind of honored to be part of many prestigious committees at the Transportation Research Board, both in the US and China. But what I want to share with you today, so in the next 40 minutes, I would like to kind of talk about three important things, three connected pieces. The first one, I want to kind of talk about what is mobility as a service, MaaS, and I want to talk about what are the externalities that these kind of systems impose in cities, particularly in terms of congestion, emissions, energy consumption. And then talk about very quickly, really, about some of the strategies that we have explored in terms of reducing these externalities and kind of quantifying externalities and reducing externalities. The second part I want to kind of share with you is based on our work in New York City, looking at the human impacts of this mobility as a service, particularly in the taxi industry, this competition between the for-hire vehicle industry like Uber, Lyft, and so on, and the traditional taxi industry, okay? And I'm going to recap some regulatory policies that are there globally in terms of what they're doing to kind of look at this problem. And the part three is very relevant, the COVID impacts of transportation and how to safely open transportation systems. These are some thoughts I'm going to share with you. So if you have questions, just feel free to kind of post them on the chat and we'll have some time for discussion at the end. So mobility as a service. So last 10 years, we have seen a rapid transformation of this mobility landscape, right? I mean, due to the convergence of technology, the smartphones and the apps that are there within the smartphones. So it has revolutionized how we look at transportation, every form of transportation, the movement of goods and people, right? So we have Uber for taxis, we have like Peloton for trucking. So various kinds of technology that has impacted how we actually move both the long haul and short haul transportation. So this convergence is really changing how cities have to respond to these type of goods movements and people movements. There's a lot of advantages why people are using this. One, certainly convenience is a big reason why people want to use this. Two, it provides real-time information and connectivity to these services when and wherever they want. You're no longer a tourist wherever you go, right? So you can easily get a cab even if I go to Singapore or come to Tokyo. And ride sharing, so you can kind of pool with people, thereby reducing the costs. And so it's saving money for a lot of people and providing kind of money and jobs for many drivers, right? So this is the ride sharing economy or the sharing economy more broadly speaking. So there's significant advantages, and there's been a lot of hype about these advantages. So if you go back to like 2010, 2012, much before the IPO of Uber, there's been a lot of articles in terms of the advantages and how this industry is reshaping cities. But then we have to look at the complete picture, right? So we need to really also look at the costs that these systems actually impose on the cities and on the people, the citizens who actually live within those cities. So which means there are also inequalities which these technologies actually result in, both for drivers as well as for the riders and the service providers. So we need to kind of look at that picture as well. And we need to quantify the externalities, the costs that they actually impose on cities. And we need to kind of be very careful and rigorous in terms of how we actually compute this cost. So if you look at this figure here shows you the trend in terms of the increase in these FHV trips, the for-hire vehicle trips, from these transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft in New York City. So you can see that the Uber and Lyft were allowed to operate around mid-2013, which is the starting point here. And you can see a rapid growth in terms of various services. Juno, Get are all smaller FHV players, but Lyft and Uber are the biggest ones. And you can see that there's a significant growth in these type of technologies. And what is the effect of these kind of technologies, right? So if you look at that, let's first look at the drivers related to these technologies. So there are three main drivers related to why these technologies have become very popular. The first, of course, is the smartphone growth, right? So they're almost, it is predicted, these are predictions from 2015, that there are going to be 2 billion smartphones in the world. And my recent statistics show that there are actually 2 billion smartphones just in the Asia Pacific region. So we have already exceeded this number of 2 billion smartphones in the world. And what are people using it for? They're using it for location-based services. They're using it for getting a taxi. They're using it for getting goods like Amazon Prime, next day delivery, right? And so the people's travel behavior is changing for the kind of trips that they actually make. This is one big driver, the growth of the smartphone usage and what people are using it for. The second is the number of sensors and the availability of cheap sensors in the smart platforms, right? So if you take a typical car like Toyota or Honda, I mean, it had about 200 plus sensors. Now a Tesla or a BMW has about 500, 600 plus sensors. So the number of sensing for lane deviations and this ability of these cars to talk with infrastructure, talk with other cars, like the V2I and V2V kind of infrastructure, has grown significantly in the last 10, 15 years. The technology has significantly improved. These have become inexpensive. So what does this do? These actually make the transportation ecosystem more connected, and cities are actually becoming connected villages within this transportation ecosystem, right? So citizens are better connected with what the agencies can provide. Agencies are better connected with the needs of these citizens. So this is the second driver that we actually see that's actually pushing this trend forward. And the third driver, or the third factor, which kind of contributes to this MaaS kind of a platforms, is the change of the typical traveler itself and their ability to use these kind of services, right? So if you see the data, about 80% of the US adults are actually using these smartphones, right? And they're using it for what kind of things? They're using it for, of course, for communication with their kids, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, but also they're using it for like mobility purposes. They're using it for Uber, they're using it for Lyft and Amazon and so on, right? So if you see the last year's statistics, there are about 40 to 45 million Uber users in the US alone. And the APAC region, right? I mean, there are, as I mentioned, there are about 2 billion smartphones and a growing number of users on these kind of MaaS platforms like Grab and Uber and so on, right? So you can pick any platform wherever you are in Asia or US or Europe. The platform might be different, but the underlying challenges and opportunities are very, very similar. So my team, we actually work with various transportation network companies and agencies and think tanks and so on. And one of our unique expertise is to kind of put together these data collaboratories and data repositories, right? So we have various kinds of data. So I wanted to share in this slide some of the data that we actually use. So we have operational data, and for example, from the taxi and FHV trips from the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission. So New York City, if you see, there are about 60,000 yellow and green taxis, and about every taxi has a GPS unit, and you can get the pickup and drop off information. So we have unique access to all of the data, about 1 million records per day, and we have this data for about 10 years for all the taxis in New York City. Similarly, we have capabilities to collect with Uber and Lyft trajectory data, and we have done this collection for about a couple of years, 38 million unique GPS records per day. And so we have this, I'll share some of that insights from those kind of data sets. So we also have built environment data, like for example, the shape files, the road network files, the travel speed information from Uber and Google, travel time information, demographic information, energy modeling and emission modeling, weather related information, flight schedules. And last time I spoke about the mobile phone data from various data providers, including SafeGraph, Yahoo Japan, and Quadrant, and so on, right? So this is a challenge of like the size and resolution of this data. This data is pretty big, and we have this for many, many years. So just storing and analyzing this data requires new kind of modeling platforms. So I won't talk about the challenges with respect to analyzing this kind of a big data, but certainly happy to kind of engage in some discussion or thoughts if someone has questions on that. So what can we do with all of this data, right? So I want to kind of focus on some of the problems that we can solve with this kind of a data, right? So first thing we can do is just a visualization and see the trends that we actually observe from this data. So I want you to first pay attention to this Uber trip data. And this is a comparison on the left that you see. This is taxi pickups, and these are FHV, the for-hire vehicle pickups in New York City. This is Manhattan here. This is the airport, JFK Airport. This is the LaGuardia Airport. So these are taxi pickups, the yellow and green taxis I was referring to. These are Uber kind of trips. So we'll kind of play this video. First, the Uber trajectories. And I want you to kind of mentally think. If I was there giving a presentation, I would kind of engage in some kind of a discussion here. But I want you to mentally make some notes as to what you observe as some of the differences here, right? So as you can see, the video is playing here, the Uber trajectories, where the thickness of this line is actually the density of the movements that are there, right? So you can see a lot of trips during certain times of the day start from the airports. And you can see LaGuardia as the day progresses, you can see more number of trips. A lot of trips within Manhattan here, less number of trips in Brooklyn, Queens, and so on, right? So you can see that, right? So you can just see the patterns, the spatio-temporal patterns. Now I'm going to play this video here. So you can see the taxi, and so I just want you to take a couple of seconds to observe the differences. And this is the heat map here. And you can see it's lighting up during certain times of the day. The clock is here, right? So same clock for both of them. This is the weekend now. And so you can see the differences in terms of the heat maps. So if you just look at the differences, a couple of things that you observe. One, in the traditional taxi, there are about 70 to 75% of the trips just within Manhattan, right? So most of the trips start or end within Manhattan. Whereas Uber, or these FHV kind of trips are more distributed. You can see them, there's good density in Brooklyn, Queens, and so on, right? So there's a lot of insights you can kind of see. Then you can see some hotspots or hubs, what we call hubs. So there's Madison Square Garden here, JFK here, LaGuardia here, and those things kind of also light up during certain times of the day, right? So you can look at these beautiful visualizations. Now, the next question is, so what? What can you do? How can you inform policy making and decision making with this? And that's really our focus, right? So we want to use all of this data to kind of allow cities to make decisions and to allow them to kind of improve the operations of the transportation systems, but also look at the impacts that are there. So the first thing I want to focus here is to talk about the inequalities using trajectory data from Uber. And I want to show you how this mobility service providers, which is again another name for MaaS, right? So which the data we have collected from New York City. So we have put a lot of different stations in New York City. And then using our API, we have collected the trajectories from all of these 200 stations that are actually there. And we mine this trajectory data and analyze the trip patterns. And we explore how these mobility service providers improve the driver matching efficiency. And we validate this with the traditional taxi system. So I want to share some of the key insights from this big data work that we have actually done. So the first thing we wanted to see is how representative is this FHV data, or the Uber and Lyft data that we actually have. And we actually plotted this real-time Uber and trip data and then compared it with some of the performance metrics that are there in New York City. So you can see some very interesting patterns. So this is from a typical Thursday to a Wednesday in a week. And here you can see, for example, on Saturday evening, there's a peak in terms of these TLC trips and Uber trips, right? Because people go out for shopping and recreational activities. Sunday is pretty flat, pretty calm, right? People are getting prepared for their weekday. And during a weekday, you see there's a peak here and there's another peak in the evening, right? Tuesday, a big peak in the evening, right? So depending on this, you can see that we actually did some validation and we see that these trips actually reflect the ground truth pretty well. And the second thing we wanted to see is what is the difference in terms of the searching time between Uber and the traditional taxi systems, right? The TTS is the traditional taxi system. So what we did was we took all the taxi drivers, they need to look for the next customer. So in terms of finding the next customer, they need to search for the next customer. And searching a customer is an empty trip. And the more empty trips they make, the more inefficiencies that are there in the system in terms of fuel consumption and empty miles traveled. So if you look at this plot, we fit the data of the searching time, which is the drop off and the distance to pick up the next passenger. And we fit this curve for this Uber data over many, many days for all drivers. And same thing for the traditional taxis. And if you quickly look at this, what we see is that the searching time is actually much lesser, right, as compared to the searching time for taxi drivers. So usually the median for this Uber is about 5 to 6 minutes. And then for the searching time median for the traditional taxi is around 20 minutes. And so there's big spread also in terms of this traditional taxi systems. You also can see that the density of this Uber trips is much higher. So the technology, having this global picture from the Uber data and the Uber platform, allows you to reduce these inefficiencies of searching time and reduces the empty miles that are there. So that's the key takeaway from this slide here. Now let's compute the social impacts, right? So let's look at what is the real, can you quantify rigorously the congestion impacts, the energy impacts, and the emission impacts for between the traditional taxi system, like before 2013 when Uber entered the market versus after 2013 and more recently from 2017 to 19. So I'll take 2 snapshots of time just as a reference, but you can do for any time periods, right? And you can replicate this analysis in any city, okay? So these are 2 snapshots, 2017 and 19. Here you can see population, the typical demographic factors remain the same pretty much. The differences are the TNC, the transportation network drivers, like Uber and Lyft and Via and so on in New York City. In 17, about 59,000 and 19, about 87,600, right? And the traditional taxi trips, about 300,000 here and decreased by about 30%, right, by 19. Whereas the TNC trips have increased by more than 50%, okay? So this is the data that we are using just to kind of take 2 snapshots to make this comparison. So before we do this comparison, we also need to do some more rigorous trajectory analysis. We need to do this 3-dimensional trajectory, estimate whether the vehicle is moving or stationary because it impacts the energy and emissions computation. So I won't go into the details. You can look at the paper if you're really interested in how do we estimate this trajectory information for all of these trips. So this is the key takeaway slide. Once we crunch all the numbers and run this machine learning model that is actually there, you can see that the average speed between this red is 17, blue is 19. The average speed in each of this borough, like Queens, Bronx, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and for all of New York metropolitan area, you can see that the speed decreases between 17 and 19. And you can see that the average decrease is about 30 to 35% decrease in terms of the speed, okay? And same thing, this is the moving average speed, and this also you can see that it decreases. And if you look at the fuel consumption, it actually increases by around 15 to 20% across all boroughs and also for overall New York City. And the same thing for the emissions, CO, NOx, and the carbon, HC, if you see, it actually increases by almost 20 to 25% depending upon what you're looking at, right? So these are all estimated based upon the state-of-the-art emissions and fuel consumption models. And we see that these are the significant externalities, both if you look at it spatially, but also if you look at it at the city as a whole. The final points here, I mean, you did not see a lot of trips starting in Brooklyn or Bronx, but they actually have a significant amount of emissions. So although they don't generate or attract most of these Uber trips, they do suffer the consequences of some of these externalities much more or almost as much as Manhattan. This plot shows that MaaS actually reduces the speed in cities. So you can see that this is the average, this distribution of speed in 17, and this is the distribution of speed in 19. And you can see that it actually decreases by almost 20% as the MaaS increases by almost 50% trips in New York City. So you can come up with this relationship and quantify as the number of FHV vehicles in a city is increasing, how much is it going to reduce the quality of life in my city, right? So this is a very nice quantification that we actually have done, and we can translate this to other cities. Now, how can we reduce these externalities? So I'll share very quickly a few thoughts. One observation we have from these millions of trips in New York City: if people are willing to kind of travel 3 blocks and wait at most 5 minutes, 80% of the trips, taxi trips in New York City, can be grouped into more than one trip, right? So you can do ride sharing or group rides. You can kind of combine them and reduce the number of vehicles, reduce the empty trips and trip mileage, right? Based on that insight, we developed this solution of a new type of a sharing mechanism in cities to reduce these externalities of trip mileage, empty trips, and the number of vehicles that are there, right? So this paper goes into some of the details of how we actually design this policy and what gains does a passenger get and what gains does the driver actually get. So if you discount this cost by this much, right, so you can see that the reduction actually changes. So this discount is given for the passengers, and you can see that as this discount increases, you can improve the total trip mileage reduction in cities, right? So there's an underlying very nice, beautiful algorithm here. I won't go into the details again in terms of how to do this matching and how to group these rides. And also this problem becomes very difficult to solve as we scale it. So we have done some nice, cool things to actually kind of solve this problem. So, and Uber has used it to kind of develop their own technology based on this taxi group rides. So I'll take a pause here. If you have any quick question, I'll take one question, and then we'll move on to part 2.